generation, prayer, meditation, contemplation, and through the total sacrifice of all worldliness, his truly spiritual nature might be released from the cravings of his lower nature, and the light within him could shine through a purified body. Purification in Gnosticism was to be attained by the practice of the spiritual way of life, the individual becoming no longer dominated by or bound to matter, verged away from it, and toward the light from which he came. It is quite an elaborate system, but I think the essential principle of it lies in this dualism and the fact that consciousness imprisoned in every living thing is the redeemer of that thing, and that this redemption must result from man making a voluntary dedication of his total existence to the service of this consciousness within him. If he did so, then he was truly upon the way of gnosis. And this way was a series of mystical expansions dominated almost totally by theological concepts, principles, and doctrines. Now, the third of our systems, which we want to contemplate for the moment, is Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism in this triad certainly plays the part of philosophy. Neoplatonism was Platonic philosophy plus the experience of man for 500 years or 600 years after the death of Plato. As we have noted in the previous discussion, the world of the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. was a very confused world, a world of disillusionments and despairs, a world in which rationality, in the form of a great system of thought, was not sufficient in itself to meet the needs of a large group of persons. Those by nature philosophical, those who like to contemplate the great ethical structures of life, stood in desperate need of a restoration of ethics. And this restoration of ethics, as is usually the case in a corrupt or decadent era, included a more or less violent revulsion against the abuses which then dominated the practices of society and also of education, culture, and the sciences. The Neoplatonists were working with the principle of wisdom. They were elevating not the mind, but something beyond and superior to the mind, to first place in the contemplation of reality. Whereas in Gnosticism, universal deity was the absolute good, in Neoplatonism, the absolute or universal deity was absolute truth. And in this, we have an entirely different premise, although the words in practical experience often seem to become synonymous. They are synonymous upon levels. The philosopher was working to achieve the experience of that truth which solves all error or refutes all error. He assumed, therefore, the existence in space of a quality known as truth. He was perfectly willing to assume that this truth was an attribute of deity. But in some way, the Neoplatonic concept of deity was this all-truthfulness. And he would say that if a thing is all-truthful, it is also all-good. Therefore, a thing that is truthful is good, whereas the Gnostic might have reversed it in the religious position and said, a thing that is good must be truthful. It was a different approach with the postulation of a different end. The mystic of the Gnostic school seeking this end which is the all-embracing love of God, whereas the Neoplatonists sought that end as the all-embracing understanding by means of which he himself might experience the state of total truth. Now, he sought truth not from the selfish intellectual desire, as Plotinus very clearly points out. He did not wish to be assumed to know more than other men. He was not of the type who wanted to get up and say, "This is the truth." His truth was beyond articulation, in word or even in thought. His truth approached a mystical experience in itself. But whereas one had the infinite believing of the Gnostic, the other had the strange desire to believe through knowing, that the individual could never be sure till he knows. Therefore, the development of the power to know, until this knowledge revealed all things knowable and all things necessary, represented largely the Neoplatonic position. Neoplatonism arose then as an effort to link the philosophy of Plato with the need for a spiritual, emotional experience of truth. This experience of truth could not be merely the transference of information. No individual could say to another man confidentially, "This is the truth." Even if it was so, and even if the statement was true, there could be no communication of truth apart from a dynamic experience which involved the immediate sense of internal knowing on the part of the person to whom the so-called truth was communicated. Truth could never be anything worldly. It could never be the truth about planets or comets or the tides or the seasons. This truth had to be the all truth, which was man's experience of the true discovery of his relationship to everything that exists, including himself. And in order to have this experience, he must also have the full experience of the wonderful world structure to which he was intimately related. He must not only think of God and about God, he must think with God. So Neoplatonism was this search for truthful thinking, thinking with the mind of God. Thus, as the Hermetic philosophers might have assumed God to be absolute law, and the Gnostic school absolute good or absolute virtue, so in the Neoplatonic school, God was the continuous state of absolute knowing. God knows all things. God is a state of eternal knowing without center or circumference. That which knows all things notes also the sparrow's fall. God is a universal knowing beyond mind, a knowing which is seated in the heart-mind structure of every creature, so that man is capable of a kind of knowing that is without mind, a kind of knowing that is strangely passionless, and yet when experienced is a total experience from which no part of the being can escape, and which causes afterwards the individual to say with the strange finality of revelation, "I know." Yet this same person could not say what he knows, because his knowledge is not of things, but of the eternal value which lies beneath all things. Thus, knowing in Neoplatonism is practically and functionally this internal power to know value, to apperceive or apprehend essential essence in things, and to experience identity with essence. Neoplatonism, therefore, would follow in the Buddhist concept that while man seems to have a mind, and seems to have a knowing power. He is actually knowing with the mind of God, whether he knows it or not. And this mind, which seems to be his, is actually an eternal mind, the eternity of which he has not recognized or accepted. Thus, Neoplatonism carries with it a certain pattern of acceptances. Acceptances of the presence of value, where it might not immediately be suspected. Now, what was the structure of Neoplatonism in relation to some of these problems with which we are concerned? It is not difficult to realize that when we start talking about essence and knowing, and the power to know apart from the power to think, that the Neoplatonists left the larger part of the Greco-Egyptian world behind them. They were thinking in an entirely different dimension also from their contemporaries. Furthermore, although Neoplatonism had within it a large number of the elements of a religion, it was not essentially religious. It was essentially a descent of the great idealistic philosophy of the classic Hellenes. As a result of this, it lacked many of the elements of glamour. St. Augustine, analyzing it in his own time, held that as far as value content was concerned, Neoplatonism was entitled to become a world religion. It had a tremendous contribution to make, and even Augustine admitted it. But he declared that it could not accomplish this. First of all, because it did not have anything to focus the public mind. It had no appeal. It lacked, as Augustine pointed out, the first essential of a religion, namely an heroic personality, preferably a martyr. That only around this concept have religions successfully been built. The second thing it lacked was an offering of a perpetual state of bliss or a perpetual state of illumination to the average man. It did not offer to the average person very much probability that in his lifetime, in the common affairs of his daily thinking, he would be likely to achieve to this state of knowing. It must again be reserved for the person who is willing to dedicate his life, his resources, his time, everything that he has, to the prodigious examination of himself and of his universe, and the contemplation of internal wealth, the wealth of idea, the pure wealth of contemplative induction. This type of thinking certainly could not be popular. Also, again, not only was Neoplatonism a minority group, but it drew around itself only a limited number of scholars, most of them not glamorous, very few of them understood, and all of them inclined to express their ideas on so abstract a level of dissertation or of oration or of writing, such as the Aeneads of Proclus or Plotinus, that they simply were not comprehensible to the average person. Thus we had three schools, all of them essentially deep, all of them descending from old footings, each one of them strangely and wonderfully practical, but all of them deficient in popular appeal, and all of them deficient in obvious simplicity, too complicated, too recondite, not suitable to move masses. Now, at this time, and under these conditions, the relationship between these schools and Christianity can be more clearly understood. Christianity moved into this great focus with an extremely simple moral ethical code. Actually, in spite of the various writings of the early church fathers, who some of them were rather vitriolic on the subject, there is no real indication that Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, or Hermeticism ever actually assailed the teachings of Jesus. They did not. They were quite aware of the ethical integrity, the simple and tremendous vitality of these teachings. Each one of them, perhaps in its own way, could have proven these teachings far better than the church theologians could have proved them. Each one had a deep sympathy for the essence, but each was composed of a type of mind that also belonged in a minority group. First of all, these three groups were made up of persons living out of time in a strange way. Perhaps the Neoplatonists were born 500 years too late. Perhaps the Hermetic philosophers were born 1,000 years too soon. And perhaps the Gnostic had the unfortunate misfortune of being born at a strategic moment when other things were more important than his own ideas. But all of these groups had a strange lack of contemporary vitality. They were deep. Many of them had descended from the old mystery systems. They had within themselves sciences and forms of knowledge that should not and did not die. But not one of them was in a position to step into the great human tragedy that was moving the face of the Near East and the Mediterranean area at the time. They could not console this average person under loss, under pain, under misery. They did not have this power of direct approach. They could take the ignorant man and educate him. They could take the unlearned man, and if he wanted to become learned, they could teach him. But they could not take the average person and console him where he was as he was. And because of these situations, the groups fell into a minority relationship to the rising power of Christianity, which had a tremendous appeal to a very large group of persons under misfortune, who wished consolation, who wanted something upon which to build hope and faith immediately, something to sustain them in a very heavy crisis. Now, what neither the church nor anyone else could know at that time was that the history of Europe and Western civilization from the beginning of the Christian era to the present day has been one constant sequence of crises. There has hardly been a moment in which the immediate need for consolation was not present. Thus, the old scholarly motions fell further and further back, away from the popular mind. And one by one, these older groups or their descendants lost popular interest. And we can say that this situation repeated itself continuously throughout history. There have always been Gnostics and Hermetists and Neoplatonists. There are today. There are always those persons who, by endowments of one kind or another, are moved into a contemplative relationship with life. There are also others whose nature is such that they are in constant need of the consoling presence of an extremely simple, direct hope. Now, what is the essential reason for this difference? Is it because some people are more sophisticated than others? Is it because some individuals like to be intellectual? Is it that some individuals pose as scientists, and that others still perhaps wish to gain distinction as philosophers? I do not think it is this at all, or any of these factors. They may exist, but I think they exist only as isolated incidents. The difference lies in the psychic integration of the being himself. The differences lie in the capacity of the person in terms of his needs, of his possible acceptances and of his inevitable rejections. Some have gone so far as to say these differences arise from chemical biology alone. This I also doubt. But there is no doubt that there is a psychological chemistry in man, and that this chemistry produces different types of persons, due to their own backgrounds, due perhaps, if we believe in rebirth, to earlier existences and previous experiences. But in any event, they are not the same. There will always be, and always has been, a limited group that will think gnosis, regardless. There is a limited group that will think in terms of Hermetism. There is a limited group that will think in terms of Neoplatonism. They simply have these natural instincts. They cannot go against them. For no man can accept that which goes against something within himself. And the differences lie there. And the demarcations and segregations of values lie within the individual. And for that reason, there will always be majority religions and there will be minority faiths. The thing that we can hope is that they do not have to remain forever in antagonistic relationship to each other. That they can be recognized as complementary and not regarded as separating man from man. Actually, in the case of the three we are discussing, they could undoubtedly have contributed much had they been able to unite around the core of the practical Christian need. They probably could have saved Europe the Dark Ages. But because of the lack of sympathy between groups, and because those who do not understand must always be impatient of that which they do not understand, lack of understanding ran instantly into misunderstanding, and this in turn led inevitably to conflict. The conflict was one-sided from the beginning, because the number of persons involved and the public appeal was so different that none of these minority groups ever really had a chance. They could not compete. They could not actually survive as such. But we also have to realize that leaders, regardless of what they lead, must of themselves also have attributes of leadership. And in the background of Christianity, there were a number of persons, Christian by conviction and conversion, and yet by nature and mind, scientists. Abstract intellectual powers certainly dip deeply into Neoplatonism and into Gnosticism. And as a result of this, the church itself gradually passed into a schismatic state in which the heresies began to appear. These heresies resulting very largely from the intellectual individuality of leaders, which continued to beset the faith even after these other organizations no longer presented a challenge. Actually, therefore, we must recognize that these three great systems, and several others, to a lesser degree, have influenced the rise of Christianity. They have influenced its doctrines. And as we have said, the uniting of the Christian front against these non-Christian movements hastened the rise of hierarchical Christianity. That is, the rise of a strong central church government, capable of clearly stating its own convictions. And this in turn called up the councils, the various gatherings, the synods, and the assemblies in which the great ecclesiastical principles were variously debated until gradually the Christianity that we know took form and appeared. Now, if we have these patterns a little bit familiar to us, we can see essentially that even in our own thinking, as in those days, the individual is not united. Synesius of Alexandria was a Christian bishop, a Neoplatonist, a Gnostic, and a Hermetist at the same time, and found no difficulty, no conflict, no contradiction, and no heresy, simply because he had not the kind of intellectual capacity that pigeonholed various concepts within his own nature. He was perhaps more able to build a magnificent faith upon the total reconciliation of the inconsistencies between these doctrines. He was also able, by the grace of God, to retain his orthodox standing in spite of all of these modifying circumstances. He therefore represents, in a sense, the synthesis of these beliefs, and to our thinking today, a rather outstanding example of the possibility of religious reconciliation. Now, reconciliation in our time does involve very strongly the problem of these three schools, and still, to a measure, the prevailing orthodoxy in which these schools function. Today, for example, we have in the world a prevailing orthodoxy. Whether it be a Christian orthodoxy or a Hindu orthodoxy is not important at the moment. We have the majority of the human beings of this world religiously integrated around certain simple, basic beliefs. These beliefs include certainly the reality of the existence of God, the immortality of the human soul, and the victory of good over evil. These beliefs are disseminated even throughout the so-called Soviet Union, and every effort of materialism in that area to overthrow these beliefs has notably failed. These beliefs exist in China, they exist in India, and in all parts of the world. Thus we have a tremendous body of belief in fundamental spiritual value. And yet, just as we had this tremendous body of believers in those days and in these times, we now find ourselves in the presence of the long shadow of a highly exaggerated Hermetic thinking. We have in that the rise of science. We have the gradual recognition that we live in a scientific universe. We have man exploring the exactitudes of space, depending completely upon such sciences as mathematics for the possible calculations by which he seeks to attain his ends. And mathematics, as Pythagoras pointed out, is the first science of God. Thus we have an excessive intellectualism which has not yet achieved the Hermetic position, namely that knowledge is suspended primarily from God as fact, the inevitable thing as it is, that God is total reality, and that this reality is the totality of all things known and unknown, and that no matter what we can ever know, we can never discover that which destroys the fact of reality. For all knowledge is the triumph of reality over superstition or ignorance. Thus, the infinite universe of realities, of facts, of scientific procedures, this universe is held within the tremendous principle of all fact, all reality, all procedure. And this principle is alive. This principle is a dynamic, not a static. And this principle permeates all other things with itself, so that everything that exists bears within it the stamp of reality. And man's search is the search for this reality in things, or in space, or in self. Now here we have then science rising, and even in our modern world, science is a minority group, very definitely a minority group. It lives in the same world with a dynamic religion, yet it is not reconciled with that religion. Yet its essential discoveries and principles are not irreconcilable with religion. They simply stand apart, much in the same way that Hermetic philosophy and the early rise of Christianity these stood apart. They had more in common than they ever knew, but they were never able to cement this common understanding. They were never able to bridge across between faith and fact. They never could recognize faith as another name for a scientific procedure. They were never able to recognize that the ways of faith are as scientific as the ways of atomic research. Because of this same division between two systems of thought, we are producing a generation of human beings in whose natures there are strong, irreconcilable, or at least unreconciled divisions. The person of today, growing up in his world, is in the presence of a constant pressure of conflicting conceptions and conflicting convictions. Going to school, he is confronted with them. And at the present time, our policy is, if this person is potentially the type of material, what we hope will become an intellectual leader, is to pass him through 4 years of college. The purpose of this being primarily to destroy his idealistic convictions. We might as just as well face it. That is what it amounts to. The purpose of it is to make him worship knowledge, and never to reveal to him that knowledge is merely the manifestation of the knower, and that without the universal knower there could be no universal knowledge to challenge him. So we have this conflict, which, inherited from the past, from little minority squabble 19 centuries ago, could very well, and does very often, land the modern young person in the juvenile courts because of conflict. Therefore, we cannot say that this long problem should just be allowed to drift, nor should we overlook the examples and the wisdom and evidence of the past relating to these things. Now, as we go along in this, we find there are other minority groups. As distinguished from the popular mind, a structure very difficult to analyze at this time, because it doesn't seem to be very sure of what it is thinking, if at all. In distinction to the popular mind, we have what we term the intellectual. Now, the intellectual, or the mental type, the individual who is searching for knowledge per se, is not necessarily searching for mathematical formulas. He is searching for the power to know, and the end of knowing, of course, is the knowledge of good and evil. The knower, the intellectual, also presents a problem. We have had nearly 18 centuries of him in the post-Christian world under the general name of the intellectual leader, the philosopher, the scholar, the learned person, the professor. Everything from the school teacher to the Oxford Dome comes under this particular heading. He is also the teacher, because the teacher is one of whom it must be assumed that he knows at least more than those he teaches. This is sometimes an assumption, but at the same time there are evidences to sustain that in most cases there is a certain leadership possible. But now this problem of knowing has given us a variety of knowing beliefs. And we have today the great clash of the intellectual schools. We have the Kantians and the Hegelians. We have the defenders of Schopenhauer and the defenders of Nietzsche. We have the new philosophies of every kind, from the idealism of Bergson to the prevailing distemper of existentialism. We have these beliefs, beliefs of disillusionment, beliefs of despair, beliefs of frustration, and of hope, and of fear. We have beliefs of all kinds, rising from or catering to the neurotic pressures of our time. So we have this mysterious thing of man who also seeks to know. He seeks to know ethically that which is good. He seeks to know to a degree idealistically that which is true for him. He would like to live well if the effort is not too great. He would like to know more than he knows, first because he thinks he could earn more that way. Sometimes he would like to know enough to be able to console himself about his own uncertainties. He wants to know. The great desire to know rises strongly in the mass mind of mankind. And here we have the conflict between knowing and not knowing. And we have the big problem of the moment. The problem that has been argued and debated for years. Namely, can we know? What can we know? Can we know anything that we will not have to unknow at some later time? Is all knowing relative? Is knowing merely the collecting of the traditional belief of our race? Is the physician a true knower after he graduates from medical school? Is the lawyer a true knower after he has read Roman law and British jurisprudence? What is knowing? Is it the individual familiarizing himself with the past, with other beliefs, with the statistical material available on the subjects that interest him? Is this knowing merely the handing on of report? And we have this very strongly in education. And Neoplatonism points out that the fallacy here is that all knowing must ascend, that the end of knowing is that man shall truly know the truth, and that the truth is something that is apart from particular knowledge. A man may discover something of truth by learning to play the piano, but if he does not add this concept to something else, he will become a musician, but he will not become a truth knower. That truth is something total, and that all education must in some way strive for this totality, but it does not know how. Thus there has to be this truth that sets us free, instead of this neo-truth that keeps us in bondage. The Neoplatonist answers very simply that the only solution to this problem is to recognize that man partakes in his own nature not only of the attributes of truth possibility, but the very substance of a living truth fact. That the truth resides in the innermost parts of the conscious life of man, and that the great journey of the individual is from ignorance to truth,